Welcome to Cause Before Symptom, uncovering the real cabal and spiritual forces that are controlling the world. And now, here is your host, James Carner.
Welcome to Cause Before Symptom. I'm your host, James Carner, and today is June 25th, 2026. Tonight's episode is all about the Abe Finkelstein mystery. Evidence, myths, and missing pieces. Now, one of the reasons the alleged James Wickstrom interview has remained controversial for so many years is the extraordinary scope of the conversation. I don't know if you guys have seen this video, but when I first saw it back in, I think, 06, 07, 08, somewhere around there, back then I wasn't really checking sources. I just assumed it was real, and it was shocking. And over the course of roughly an hour, the guest, identified as Rabbi Abe Finkelstein, appears to respond to questions covering banking, international politics, religion, media, immigration, war, the Federal Reserve, the Holocaust, 9/11, Hollywood, feminism, race, and global power. And rather than challenging the interview's accusations, the guest frequently responds with apparent agreement, often making even stronger statements than the questions themselves, meaning of some Jewish conspiracy that they're really in control of the world, right? Now, this unusual interview style is one of the reasons the recording has attracted both intense belief and intense skepticism. And the interview presents a worldview in which a small network of powerful individuals allegedly manipulates governments, financial systems, wars, media organizations, and cultural institutions for political and economic gain. And the guest repeatedly describes wealth, influence, and long-term planning as the primary motivations behind these actions, while the interviewer frames many of the discussions points through his own religious understanding of biblical prophecy and spiritual conflict. Now, throughout the conversation, references are made to central banking, international finance, the Federal Reserve, political lobbying, the Middle East, communism, and various historical events. And those topics are presented as interconnected pieces of a much larger system rather than in isolated historical events. As the interview progresses, the discussion becomes increasingly sensational. It gets out there where the guy says that Finkelstein says they, as the Jews, grind up all of the human beings they steal, like we're talking about, missing people, right? Grind it up and put it into sausages, and the people eat it for breakfast, including their biggest supporter and purchaser, McDonald's. I'm not saying it's true or not. We don't know. But the guest appears to make these admissions and includes the Holocaust, September 11th attacks, intelligence agencies, wars in the Middle East, media ownership, immigration, and the influence of organized financial interests, which really, I think, this catapulted a lot of the propaganda that's out there now about the entire, Jews run the world thing, okay? Now, the recording also contains numerous statements regarding Judaism and the Talmud, Christian theology, and biblical interpretation, and many of these claims are presented without supporting evidence inside the interview itself, leaving listeners to determine whether independent historical documentation exists to support or contradict them, because the recording moves rapidly from subject to subject, and each major claim ultimately requires its own separate investigation rather than being accepted or rejected as a single package. The interview gets pulled down everywhere it gets put up. And when I saw this the other day, it was back up on TikTok. I decided I think it's important to do a show about this because I wanted to go and find the evidence for it. And perhaps the most striking characteristic of this interview is not only the individual claim, but the tone of the conversation itself. The guest rarely argues with the interviewer and seldom asks for any clarification, and often responds in ways that reinforce the interviewer's assumptions. Well, for supporters, this conversational style is interpreted as an insider openly admitting hidden truths. But for critics, it raises questions about whether the interview represents a genuine exchange, a staged performance, or another form of scripted presentation. But regardless of where one ultimately stands, the interview's structure remains one of the central mysteries surrounding the recording and one of the primary reasons it continues to be debated decades after it first appeared. In fact, there's so little information about this story that what I'm going to be publishing is going to be the biggest article on the story, because apparently nobody's picking it up and even trying to research it. In fact, there are no fact checker websites with any facts to check the information other than we say it's a hoax. Trust me, bro. So, welcome back to Cause Before Symptom, where we don't chase headlines. We investigate the causes behind them. And tonight's episode is unlike anything. And what I read before was the foreword. It was like anything we've ever done before, because we're not beginning with a conclusion here. We're beginning with a question in a world where everyone seems to know exactly what happened before they examine the evidence. And we're going to slow down here. We're going to gather the facts and follow them wherever they lead. That may sound simple, but it has become one of the rarest things in modern media, right? Actually reporting the truth. If I can find the facts that back it up, I'm going to say it's a fact. If I can't, I'm going to say it's alleged. Now, for many years, an interview has circulated across the internet that allegedly features Pastor James Wickstrom speaking with a man identified as Rabbi Abe Finkelstein or Finkelstein. Depending on who you ask, it is either one of the greatest whistleblower interviews ever recorded or one of the most obvious hoaxes ever produced. The problem is that almost everyone seems to have chosen a side before even asking a more important question here. What can actually be proven? Well, that is the question we intend to answer tonight. And one of the first lessons every investigator learns is that evidence and conclusions are not the same thing. Evidence consists of documents, recordings, photographs, eyewitnesses, timelines, and records that can be examined independently of each other. Conclusions are what we build after examining that evidence. Unfortunately, the internet often works in reverse. Someone reaches a conclusion first, then searches for information that supports it while ignoring everything that doesn't. Well, whether the conclusion is it's absolutely true or it's absolutely fake, the process is equally flawed if the evidence comes second. So tonight we're going to resist that temptation, okay? We're not here to defend Pastor James Wickstrom, whom the media he died, but the media claims he's a racist. And we are not here to defend the unidentified man calling himself Rabbi Abe or Abraham Finkelstein. We are not here to defend fact-checking organizations or conspiracy researchers or anything else, or anyone else for that matter. Our loyalty is to the evidence. And if the evidence supports a claim, we will say so. If it contradicts a claim, we will say that too. And if the evidence simply isn't there, we will have the humility to admit that we don't know. Now, that last phrase has become surprisingly difficult for many people to say. I actually say it all the time. And somewhere along the way, uncertainty became something to fear instead of something to investigate. Yet history is filled with mysteries that remained unsolved for decades until one overlooked document or forgotten recording or eyewitness testimony finally connected the missing pieces. And at the same time, history is also filled with extraordinary stories that captured the imagination of millions, but ultimately collapsed because the evidence could not support them. Honest investigators must be willing to accept either outcome. And as we begin preparing for this episode, something unexpected actually happened. We searched for books devoted to this interview. We searched academic databases, archives, and historical references. We searched for investigative reports, documentaries, and serious research. And what we found was astonishingly little. There are thousands of discussions arguing about the interview, but almost nobody appears to have investigated the interview itself. That's interesting. And most articles are only a few paragraphs long before declaring it authentic or dismissing it entirely. Well, that leaves an enormous gap between certainty and evidence. Now, normally, when it's a hoax, there are people who will especially probably like the Anti-Defamation League, who would take this story and go and dig and do the research and prove that it's a hoax. But nobody's done that either. So that gap is where tonight's journey begins, because we're going to ask questions that should have been asked years ago, at least by 2006 when it came out. What exactly, or who exactly, was James Wickstrom? What was the Turner Radio Network? Did the broadcast actually air as described? Who was Pastor Bob, whom Wickstrom says he was filling in for? Was there ever a rabbi named Abe or Abraham Finkelstein? Or was that an alias? And can the recording itself be authenticated? Well, also, is there a chain of custody for the audio? Why does the commonly circulated photograph associated with the interview appear to belong to someone else? They claim this is Rabbi Finkelstein, but it's some other Jewish lawyer in New York. It's not him. Weird. So each question deserves its own investigation instead of being buried beneath assumptions, right? Now, along the way, we'll also examine a broader issue that extends far beyond this particular interview. How should we evaluate controversial information in the digital age? Is censorship evidence that something is true? No. Is a fact check automatically correct simply because it's called a fact check? Also no. Every source deserves to be evaluated by the quality of its evidence, not by its popularity, ideology, or reputation. You see, truth is not established by majority vote, nor is it destroyed because someone disagrees with it. Now, our goal tonight is not to leave you with all the answers. It's not. That's not the goal. Our goal is to leave you with a better understanding of the questions, the evidence that exists, and the evidence that is still missing. If we discover that parts of the story can be verified, we will acknowledge them. If we discover that other parts cannot be substantiated, we will acknowledge that as well. So the strength of an investigation is not measured by how dramatic its conclusion is, but by how faithfully it follows the facts. And the Bible says to not lie. And that's my job. I can't give you information on this show if it's backed by nothing. But this is a very strange story. And I'm really glad I'm covering it because nobody else has. Because tonight we reopen a cold case that has lingered on the internet for decades. And we dust off the files, we examine the documents, we compare the claims, we challenge our own assumptions, and rebuild the timeline one piece at a time. Whether this investigation ultimately confirms, contradicts, or complicates what people believe about the Abe Finkelstein interview, one thing is definitely certain. The truth deserves more than opinions. It deserves evidence, and tonight we begin that search. Looking forward to tonight's show. Shout out to everybody on the live chat rumble. Number one warrior is Scorpion. Scorpion says, hey, Pastor and Warrior family, glad to be back with y'all. Scorpion, good to have you here. Number two warrior is Philip Del Piano. Philip says, hello, James and Scorpion. Guys, thank you so much for being here. I really appreciate it. Let's go ahead and get into breaking news.
Welcome to Shitty Breaking News with your host, James Carner, offering his shitty opinion.
Well, Iran strikes a cargo ship on UN-backed route in Strait of Hormuz. Well, it looks like we're back at it again. How long is this going to take? Well, a lot of skeptics have said, well, or not skeptics, but critics of Donald Trump say that this happened because Donald Trump opened his big fat mouth and said, well, we only had 4 weeks of oil left. And then Iran's like, well, screw this, man. Let's make sure that they hunker down. Well, who knows? I really don't care. Look. If you're a Christian, you don't need to worry about this stuff, okay? If gas prices go up, this is nothing that God can't handle. You just pray about it. Say, Lord, help me with my finances, and he will, okay? Venezuela earthquake, staggering destruction signals urgent warning for the people around. Well, let me tell you this. That, I can't prove it, but it seems awfully convenient when Venezuela was like, maybe we should sell some oil to China without America knowing, because they agreed to take to sell their oil in U.S. dollars. And we also saw some videos of the new prime minister, or I don't know, president of Venezuela, this lady whom was shaking the hands first of China and Iran, and then shook hands to America and the rest, which the look on the guy's face, like, please honor us, and all of that is in her hands. And apparently Venezuela is being pressured to go back against America. Well, you do that, we earthquake you. That's what I think happened. I can't prove it, okay? I don't know if it's true or not, but knowing that we do have these type of weapons, we can create earthquakes anywhere around the world. If Venezuela is not going to do what we say, and we also know that a couple weeks ago, Trump did another excursion in there and blew some shit up. So Venezuela, get in line. Otherwise, we will destroy you, because you guys have nothing as an army, and we want your oil. Sorry. Supreme Court allows Trump to end protected status for Haitian and Syrian migrants. Okay. The Supreme Court also basically said, I can't remember. All I know is the Postal Service, did they just say recently they're not going to deliver any mail-in ballots for those blue states? I don't know. Look, they're all trying to cheat. Trump cheats, Obama cheated, Bush cheated, Clinton's cheated. They all cheat, including Trump. They all cheat. Okay. Now a lot of you saying, well, no, Trump's a Christian. He would never cheat. Bullshit. Okay. If he was a Christian, he wouldn't lie. And he gets caught lying all the time. He would just not bring up the subject if he has to lie, right? There's ways around it. You don't have to. So my opinion, Trump, he's not a very good man. And we fell for it, okay? We're talking about a Democrat who switched to a Republican and basically won the hearts of the right by saying everything that we were thinking out loud. And that's what a shenanigan charlatan does. Anna Paulina Luna has paralyzed the House and fellow Republican. Who gives a shit? Jonathan Rinderknecht, jurors deadlocked in arson trial of Palisades fire suspect. Look, if he's a suspect and he's found guilty, put him in jail. I can't believe the jurors are deadlocked. That means either the jurors were, bought and paid for. It happens. Don't put it past California. They don't like their own citizens. They're gonna lie to get their way. But it could very well be that they just don't have as much evidence, and that's why they're deadlocked. Because they say, hey, this guy is a suspect. So, fire suspect. That doesn't mean he's guilty. What led to an unusual courtroom clash between Justices Alito and Sotomayor? Who gives a shit? All right, and there you have it, guys. I mean, really, the news is just as depressing as it can be. So don't listen to it. It's all a bunch of bullshit. All right, when we come back from a quick commercial, we're going to finish up our interview with Rabbi Abe Finkelstein and the whole controversy behind that crap.
It's complicated. The future of America looks like what? Prepare to be amazed.
Whoa. We pay our federal income tax.
What?
LiveTaxFree.net. LiveTaxFree.net. LiveTaxFree.net /10 a.m.
I always giggle at that commercial. That's their latest commercial they gave me. I do like Kirk and Company. Those guys are great. And I really do believe that what they're doing is, I think, a good thing. That's just me. And I signed up for it. I think you should too. This is the loophole. It's not even a loophole. It's legal. This is the legal thing that big corporations do to save money. And this is how you do it. All right, guys. Have you seen that interview between Rabbi Finkelstein and that pastor? What is his name? James Wickstrom, who was filling in for Pastor Bob. All right. The rabbi was basically talking about kidnapping children and people, crushing them up and putting them into sausages and selling them to McDonald's, and also all about the the new world order and how they're trying to depopulate it. It's like one interview of what seems like just an evil man who says that their Talmud says Satan is their God, with a pastor who says, hey, my God says don't do this, and they go back and forth and back and forth, and it's absolutely terrifying when you first hear it, because the consensus of the entire interview is you're not going to believe it anyway, so here it is. And yet it's completely been debunked and it's called a hoax without any evidence for it to be a hoax and be debunked. So I just started to do my own research. And here's what I found. Now, there are thousands of interviews uploaded to the internet every single day. Most are watched for a few weeks, discussed for a short period of time, and then quietly disappears into the endless archives of forgotten content. As we doom scroll. Every once in a while, however, a recording refuses to die. It continues to circulate year after year and finding new audiences with each generation of listeners. The alleged interview between Pastor James Wickstrom and a man named or identified as Rabbi Abe or Abraham Finkelstein is one of those recordings. Now, whether viewed as an extraordinary confession or an elaborate fabrication, it has survived far longer than many professionally produced documentaries. And the first question is not whether it's true or false. The first question here is why this particular recording continues to capture people's attention decades after it was supposedly broadcast. I even read many pastors, they say that the Lord told them that it was real. Well, we'll find out. Now, part of its staying power comes from the extraordinary nature of the conversation itself. If taken at face value, the guest appears to agree with nearly every accusation made by the interviewer, making statements that touch on banking, politics, war, religion, media, and world affairs. Now, I'm not going to play the conversation here. You can go look it up for yourself. And I'm not going to add any links because it gets taken down everywhere it gets put up. So you're going to have to really search to find it yourself. But the conversation is dramatic from the beginning to the end, and it is structured in a way that almost guarantees a strong emotional reaction. It did for me 20 years ago. Now, some listeners finish the interview convinced that they have heard one of the greatest admissions ever recorded. Others finish it believing it is so unbelievable that it must have been staged from the very beginning. And rarely does anyone finish the interview without taking a side. Well, that immediate division presents a challenge for anyone attempting to investigate the recording honestly. Once people become emotionally invested in a conclusion, they naturally begin looking for information that confirms what they already believe. And psychologists call this confirmation bias. And it affects everyone regardless of education, profession, or even worldview. Now, we're all tempted to collect evidence that supports our position while overlooking evidence that complicates it, okay? Recognizing that tendency is one of the first responsibilities of any investigator, and our goal tonight is not to eliminate bias completely. That would be impossible, but to become aware of it and prevent it from directing the investigation. Now, as we begin researching this episode, one discovery immediately stood out to me. And despite the interview's widespread circulation, there is remarkably little serious research devoted to it. That's weird. I mean, I thought I was going to find blog after blog after blog of at least, 1,000 to 2,000 words. But no, I mean, we've got nothing out there. It's just, here's the interview, click here, it's a hoax. Or here's the interview, God told me it's real. That's it. Nobody actually has any data to support this thing. So that's weird. And there are countless reposts of the recording. There are dozens of transcripts, reaction videos, and online discussions stretching back many, 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 many years. Yet when searching for documentation or any investigations or historical analysis or even a detailed examination of its own origins, the trail grows surprisingly thin. Why? If it's a hoax, then we should have evidence to support it. And most articles consist of only a few paragraphs before declaring the interview either genuine or fraudulent. And we're talking out of thousands of blogs, just one paragraph. But few out of all of them attempt to reconstruct the recording's history, identify its earliest appearance, or even establish a documented chain of custody from the alleged broadcast to the vision circulating online today. Well, that absence of documentation is not proof of anything by itself, as history contains many legitimate recordings that survived with very little accompanying paperwork. Old radio broadcasts were often taped over, local stations frequently discarded archives, and independent broadcasters rarely preserved their material with the care of national networks. While at the same time, the absence of documentation also prevents us from treating the recording as automatically authentic. A missing paper trail neither proves nor disproves the interview. It simply leaves us with an unanswered question that deserves further investigation. And this leads us to an important principle that will guide the rest of this episode. Every claim must stand on its own evidence. It is tempting to accept or reject the entire interview as a single package, but that approach often creates unnecessary confusion. Now, the recording contains dozens of individual claims about history, economics, politics, religion, and current events. Some of those claims may be supported by independent evidence. Others may be contradicted by historical records. Still, others may remain impossible to verify with the information currently available. Well, an honest investigation evaluates each claim individually instead of assuming that proving one statement automatically proves or disproves the entire recording. Another challenge arises when from the internet itself. Modern digital platforms create the illusion that information has always existed online. It hasn't. And in reality, much of the early internet has disappeared. Websites vanish, forums close, hosting companies go out of business. Out of tens and tens of decades, that happens. And personal archives are actually lost when hard drives fail or owners just pass away. That happens too. Well, as a result, reconstructing the history of an obscure recording from the 1990s or early 2000s can be surprisingly difficult. And sometimes the oldest surviving copy of a recording is already several generations removed from the original source, making it much harder to determine exactly when, where, and how it first appeared. Well, that reality has led many researchers to overlook one of the most valuable forms of evidence: context. A recording does not exist in isolation. Every broadcast exists within a larger environment that includes radio stations, program schedules, guest announcements, advertisements, listener correspondence, newsletters, station logs, and contemporary references, not including the meta information that's inside the file in itself. And if this interview truly aired as described, traces of its existence may survive outside the recording itself. Well, our investigation will therefore extend beyond the audio. We will search for the world surrounding the interview in hopes that it reveals information the recording alone cannot provide. And throughout this series, you will hear us distinguish carefully between three different categories. First are documented facts, information supported by independent records that can be examined and verified. Second are plausible possibilities. These are ideas that fit the available evidence but cannot be confirmed, not yet anyway. Third are unsupported assertions. These are claims presented without any sufficient evidence to establish their accuracy. So keeping these categories separated, I think, is essential. Too often, discussions about controversial subjects blur these distinctions until facts, opinions, assumptions, and speculation become impossible to separate. So we intend to keep those lines as clear as possible. And by the end of tonight's investigation, you may still believe the interview is authentic. And you may conclude that it was staged. And you may decide the truth lies somewhere in between. Well, whatever conclusion you reach, we ask only one thing. Let your conclusion be guided by the evidence rather than by your expectations or how you feel. The purpose of this episode is not to win an argument, it is to conduct an investigation. Every mystery deserves to be approached with curiosity, patience, and intellectual honesty. Only then can we actually hope to separate the evidence from myths and the many missing pieces surrounding one of the internet's most enduring mysteries. Now, before we can evaluate one of the most controversial interviews on the internet, we first need to understand the man asking the questions, okay? Too often discussions about this recording begins assumptions about James Wickstrom instead of documented history. Supporters sometimes portray him as a fearless truth teller, while critics often describe him only through the most controversial aspects of his public life. Neither approach helps us understand the historical record. The purpose of this investigation, not to defend or condemn James Wickstrom, but to establish who he was, what he believed, and why his name became attached to one of internet's most enduring mysteries. Now, James Wickstrom emerged as a public figure within the Christian identity movement, a religious ideology that developed in the 20th century and became associated with various nationalist and separatist organizations. Now, Christian identity itself is a complex subject with many competing interpretations. It's on a spectrum. And its teachings differed from mainstream Christianity on numerous theological and historical issues. Now, Wickstrom became one of its more recognizable voices through sermons, radio broadcasts, newsletters, and public speaking. And whether one agrees with his beliefs or strongly rejects them, as many call him a racist, there is no dispute that he was an active broadcaster who spent years discussing religion, politics, economics, and world events with his audience. Now, unlike the mysterious figure known as Rabbi Abe or Abraham Finkelstein, James Wickstrom is well documented. Newspaper articles, court records, interviews, government files. He's got FBI files, no joke. Recorded sermons, books, newsletters, and audio broadcasts all establish that he was a real individual with a long public history. His life has been examined by journalists, historians, government agencies, supporters, and critics alike. Now, this distinction is important because it gives investigators a firm starting point. Now, we're not dealing with an anonymous internet personality whose identity exists only through rumor. We are dealing with someone whose existence and activities can be independently verified through multiple historical sources. And as we reviewed Wickstrom's sermons and writings, I have many, one characteristic, not because I downloaded him, not because I listened to his stuff, but one characteristic became immediately apparent. He rarely confined himself to strictly religious subjects. His broadcasts often blended biblical interpretation with discussions of banking, government, history, economics, international affairs, race, and current events. In a way, some could call him a racist conspiracy theorist, right? But whether listeners agreed with his conclusions or not, his programs reflected a worldview in which spiritual, political, and financial systems were deeply interconnected, something that I'm interested in, but not interested in the idea that he's a racist, and we'll talk more about that in a sec. So this helps explain why the alleged interview with Rabbi Abe Finkelstein covers such of a broad range of topics rather than focusing on theology alone. It fit the style of discussion that his audience had come to expect. Now, one detail that deserves careful attention is Wickstrom's experience as a radio host. This was not someone unfamiliar with interviewing guests or speaking before an audience. Broadcasting requires preparation, timing, and an understanding of how to engage listeners over long periods of time. To be in radio, I know this because I used to work in radio. They don't just throw you in. You need experience. And throughout his ministry, Wickstrom participated in interviews, call-in programs, and discussions on a variety of subjects. Now, that background raises important questions for our investigation. If the Finkelstein interview was genuine, how was it arranged? If it was not genuine, what purpose would such a broadcast have served? Well, those questions remain open, but they cannot be explained until we first recognize that Wickstrom possessed the experience necessary to conduct either a legitimate interview or a carefully structured radio presentation. Now, another aspect of Wickstrom's public life is impossible to ignore. He was a deeply polarizing figure. To his supporters, he challenged institutions that they believed needed to be questioned. I'm on that same side. To his critics, he promoted ideas they considered dangerous and historically inaccurate. Well, if I can find evidence, I'm a part of it. But that polarization continues today because opinions about Wickstrom are often so strong that many discussions about the interview stop before they begin. Now, some people dismiss everything associated with him without examining the evidence, while others accept every claim because they trust the source. But neither response reflects sound historical methodology. Every document, every recording, and every claim deserves to be evaluated on its own merits, regardless of who presents it. Now, as investigators, we must also guard against a common logical mistake known as the genetic fallacy. All right, this occurs when a claim is accepted or rejected solely because of its source rather than because of the evidence supporting it. Imagine discovering an unsigned historical letter in an archive. Its accuracy would not depend entirely on who wrote it, but on whether its contents could be corroborated through independent evidence. Well, the same principle applies here. James Wickstrom's reputation, whether viewed positively or negatively, does not automatically determine the authenticity of the interview. It provides context, but it cannot substitute for evidence. And one of the more interesting discoveries during the research is how much primary material Wickstrom actually left behind. His recorded sermons, written publications, newsletters, and radio broadcasts provide investigators with an opportunity that is often unavailable in controversial historical cases. Rather than relying entirely on secondhand descriptions, we can examine his own words directly. And this is an enormous advantage because primary sources allow us to compare his speaking style, recurring themes, and documented activities with the interview under investigation. And they may also reveal whether he ever referred to this broadcast again or mentioned Rabbi Abe Finkelstein elsewhere or discussed the circumstances surrounding the alleged interview. Well, those are questions worth pursuing because primary sources often reveal details that later summaries actually overlook. What's up, Robert? Perhaps the most important conclusion we can reach at this stage, also the simplest, James Wickstrom was not a myth, an internet fabrication, or a fictional character created for an audio recording. He was a real broadcaster with an established history, documented beliefs, and a substantial public record. And the fact provides a solid foundation for the investigation because the mystery is not whether James Wickstrom existed. The mystery is what happened during this particular broadcast, who was sitting on the other end of the microphone, and why so many questions remained unanswered decades later. And having established the identity of the interviewer, we now turn our investigation to the far more elusive figure at the center of the controversy, the man introduced to listeners as Rabbi Abe Finkelstein. So every mystery eventually arrives at the same question. Who was the person at the center of it? In this investigation, the question is surprisingly difficult to answer. Unlike James Wickstrom, whose life is documented through public records, newspapers, governments, files, books, and recorded sermons, the man introduced as Rabbi Abe Finkelstein seems to leave almost no independent historical footprint at all. The absence is the very reason this interview has become so controversial. And before we can evaluate anything he supposedly said, we must first determine whether we can establish who he was. Now, as investigators, identity is not a minor detail. It is the foundation upon which every other conclusion rests. And the first step in any historical investigation is to search for independent sources. If someone held a public position as a rabbi, especially one knowledgeable enough to discuss politics, religion, economics, and history on a national radio broadcast, we would normally expect to find traces of that individual elsewhere. Synagogue directories, newspaper articles, and I've searched community bulletins, conference announcements, interviews, books, academic references, or organizational records. Well, they often leave behind a trail, right? Yet, after extensive searching, very little appears that exists independently of the interview itself. Now, he could have been using a fake stage name. Could have been, because the kinds of stuff that he said was pretty nasty. But nearly every mention of Abe or Abraham Finkelstein eventually circles back to some recording or to websites discussing the recording. Now, that does not prove the name was false, but it does mean we currently lack independent confirmation of the identity presented during the broadcast. Now, one possible explanation is that the name was genuine and the historical record was simply lost, maybe. History contains countless examples of local pastors, teachers, activists, and community leaders who left behind very little documentation despite spending years speaking publicly. Now, before the internet became the permanent archive it is today, many local radio programs disappeared almost completely once they aired. Now, newspaper archives remain incomplete as well, and community newsletters were often printed in small numbers but never digitized. Cassette recordings degraded or were discarded, and it is entirely possible for a legitimate individual to leave behind only scattered traces. Possible, especially if that person never sought national attention, or even if he died, because we know the other dude died. Well, this possibility reminds us that the absence of evidence should not automatically be confused with evidence of absence, if that makes sense. So another possibility is that Abe Finkelstein was not the man's real name at all, which I'm kind of thinking that, and I don't know if it's true or not, but I wouldn't, the stuff that he said, it would have just, if it was really him and he worked in somewhere in New York, it would have been found. People would have hunted him down. So another possibility is that Abe's name wasn't real. And throughout history, people have used aliases for many different reasons. Journalists, they've actually protected confidential sources, as maybe that's what happened here. And political dissidents have written under assumed names, as intelligence operatives have concealed identities, and religious converts have adopted new names, while witnesses also have hidden their identities out of fear. Even ordinary radio callers sometimes introduce themselves by first name only or by a nickname rather than revealing their full identity to a national audience. Well, if the guest believed he was discussing controversial subjects, an alias would not have been impossible. And the challenge is that while this explanation is plausible, we currently possess no direct evidence confirming it, right? So supporters of the interview frequently argue that the use of a false name would have been the necessary thing to do to protect the guest from retaliation. And critics respond that extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence and that anonymity makes independent verification nearly impossible. But both arguments contain an element of truth. Anonymous sources have exposed genuine corruption throughout history, but anonymity has also been used to shield fabricated stories from scrutiny. Okay, meaning the people who are doing bad will use what's called paid opposition and under anonymity expose a little bit of the story, but add a bunch of lies to steer people off of their direction. Because anonymity can serve both legitimate and deceptive purposes. It cannot by itself establish authenticity or fraud. Instead, it simply raises the standard of evidence required elsewhere in the investigation. And the controversy surrounding the photograph commonly associated with Rabbi Abe Finkelstein illustrates why careful documentation matters. Now, over time, an image began circulating online claiming to depict the mysterious rabbi. Researchers later discovered that the photograph belonged to another individual entirely. Even some people who continue to defend the interview have acknowledged that the image was selected because no verified photograph of the alleged guest could be located. Well, this tells us something important. The photograph should no longer be treated as evidence regarding the guest's identity. And it demonstrates how easily information can become attached to a story without independent verification, gradually taking on the appearance of fact simply because it has been repeated so often. In fact, the picture itself is just another name, another person, another New York attorney. But his name is not Abe Finkelstein. And I have read in some forums that they said that that is Abe Finkelstein. That was really him, but he hid the name. But again, proof. Where's the proof? There's another question that deserves careful consideration here. If Abe Finkelstein was a fabricated identity, well, then who created it? Was it introduced by James Wickstrom? Did he set this whole thing up and have a brilliant script to go back and forth like that so that it was like it flowed? I mean, that's hard to do. Was it supplied by someone else before the interview was arranged? Did the guest identify himself by that name, or was it assigned later when copies of the recording began circulating online? Well, these possibilities are often treated as if they were interchangeable, but they're not. Each points toward a different explanation for how the interview came into existence. And without original broadcast records or production notes, distinguishing between these possibilities, well, it becomes difficult. And that is precisely why recovering additional historical documents could dramatically change what we know about this case. And as we examine the recording itself, another observation emerged. The guest speaks confidently and without apparent hesitation across an extraordinary range of subjects. He discusses religion, finance, international politics, military conflicts, historical events, and social issues in rapid succession. Like, perfect. Like he knew what he was talking about. And whether one finds those statements convincing or implausible, the performance is, well, unusual for a case of being a setup. Some listeners interpret that confidence as evidence of authenticity. Others view it as evidence of rehearsed role-playing. Confidence alone proves neither. Skilled speakers can present accurate information persuasively, but they can also present inaccurate information with equal confidence. So the tone of a speaker may influence how listeners feel about a message, but it cannot establish whether the message is true or not. And at this point in the investigation, we must resist the temptation to fill in gaps in the historical record with assumptions, okay? We need to put on our big boy hats, pull the thumbs out of our mouths, and grow up and not just start pointing fingers. We have to have evidence, okay? We have the Bible for our evidence of God. Well, when we put something so controversial like this online, we have to be grown-ups and find the evidence. So we know someone participated here in the conversation. We know that because this happened before AI. I've seen it myself. I've heard the recording back in 2006. So someone participated. And we know the recording exists because we know it's been handed down after generation. And we know the name Abe Finkelstein became attached to that recording. And beyond those facts, much remains uncertain. We do not yet know whether the name was genuine or whether it was an alias or whether the guest held the position claimed during the interviews or whether later copies accurately preserve the original broadcast. Now, these unanswered questions are not weaknesses in the investigation. They actually are the investigation. Every unresolved detail becomes a lead to pursue rather than an opportunity to substitute speculation for evidence. So perhaps the most honest conclusion we can reach at this stage is also the most unsatisfying. We cannot yet establish the identity of the man introduced as Rabbi Abe Finkelstein with the level of confidence historians would normally require. Now, that does not end the investigation. Instead, it shifts our focus toward the recording itself. If the identity of the speaker remains uncertain, perhaps the audio can reveal what the missing documents cannot. Can the recording be dated? Does it contain clues about where it was produced? Has it been edited? Can modern forensic techniques tell us anything about its origins? Those questions must move us beyond names and into the evidence itself, and they form the next step in our search for the truth behind one of the internet's most enduring mysteries. So every criminal investigation eventually reaches a point where the focus shifts from people to physical evidence. Now, witnesses may disagree. Memories may fade. Opinions may conflict, but physical evidence often tells its own story. In our investigation, the recording itself is the closest thing we have to physical evidence. And whether the interview is authentic, partially authentic, edited, or entirely staged, the audio contains clues that deserve careful examination. I haven't seen anybody do an examination on the audio. I'm just saying, I'm the only one. And rather than asking whether we agree with what is being said, we first need to determine what the recording can tell us about its own history. Now, the first question investigators should ask is surprisingly simple. Do we possess the original recording? Well, at this point, the answer appears to be no, we don't. Every version currently circulating online seems to originate from copies that has been duplicated numerous of times over many years. Now, some have been converted to cassette tapes to digital files. Others have been uploaded to video platforms with added images, introductions, subtitles, or background music. Each new copy introduces another generation between the listener and the original source. Now, this process, known as generation loss, gradually removes information that could otherwise help authenticate a recording. With access to the earliest available copy, investigators must work with material that may already have passed through several hands. And one of the most valuable pieces of evidence would be a complete, uninterrupted recording taken directly from the original broadcast. Such a recording might contain station identifications, commercial breaks, local advertisements, call letters, timestamps, or engineering tones that were later removed from internet uploads. Well, these seemingly insignificant details can become invaluable. Radio historians have authenticated old broadcasts simply by identifying local businesses mentioned during commercial breaks or by matching weather reports or archived meteorological records. Well, sometimes a single forgotten advertisement provides enough information to narrow the recording to a particular city and date. Unfortunately, many copies of the Wickstrom interview begin after the broadcast is already underway or end before the station signs off, leaving investigators without any of the contextual clues that normally accompany historical radio recordings. The recording itself also raises questions about editing. Modern audio software makes it relatively easy to splice conversations together, remove pauses, rearrange statements, or alter the sequence of events. However, editing audio convincingly was for more difficult 20 or 30 years ago than it is today. Detecting edits requires more than simply listening for awkward pauses. Now, professional forensics analysis examine waveform continuity, background noise, microphone characteristics, tape hiss, compression artifacts, frequency response, and changes in room acoustics. Well, a sudden shift in background noise may indicate an edit. A change in microphone quality could suggest that material from different recording sessions was combined. But none of these observations automatically prove manipulation, but they provide investigators with measurable data rather than speculation. Now, voice analysis presents another intriguing possibility. Today, forensic laboratories use software capable of comparing vocal characteristics across multiple recordings. Investigators can examine speech rhythm, pronunciation patterns, breathing habits, vocal frequency, accent consistency, and hundreds of subtle characteristics unique in an individual speaker. If enough authenticated recordings of James Wickstrom exist, and many appear to, his voice could be compared directly to the interview in the disputed recording. And more interestingly, if researchers identify other frequent guests, like radio hosts or associates, from the same broadcasting network, then these voices could also be compared with the unidentified guests. Such analysis would not necessarily reveal the speaker's identity, but it might eliminate certain possibilities or strengthen others. In some of the blogs that I've read, some of the people were saying that the rabbi was actually Wickstrom, but we can't prove that. And looking at the audio, it doesn't appear to be. It appears to be another person. So if it was him, he'd have to splice it up, and there doesn't seem to be any evidence of doing that. Now, the interview itself may also contain hidden timestamps, which we didn't find any. And during long conversations, speakers often reference current events without realizing that they're creating historical markers. Now, they mention political leaders, recent legislation, wars, economic conditions, sporting events, holidays, or breaking news that can later be compared against documented timelines. Well, if the guest refers to an event that had not yet occurred on the claimed broadcast date, then investigators immediately know something's wrong. Well, conversely, if every reference consistently aligns with a narrow historical window, confidence in the recording's time frame does increase. Now, this process, known as internal dating, has been used for decades by historians, authenticating letters, diaries, manuscripts, and recorded speeches. And one detail that deserves closer attention is the interview's conversational flow, which, by the way, all of the evidence, we have not found any evidence of tampering on this. It seems to be a consistent recording. So one detail that deserves closer attention is the interview's conversational flow. Anyone who has spent time around live radio, I have, knows that genuine interviews rarely proceed without interruption. Telephone delays come, accidental interruptions, commercial breaks, technical glitches, coughing, paper shuffling, producers speaking off microphone, and occasional dead air. They're very common features of live broadcasting. If a recording appears unusually polished for an unscripted interview, investigators naturally ask whether portions were removed or rearranged, which we found there were none. But again, we have like a copy of 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 a copy, if not 1,000 times. So on the other hand, imperfections can be staged intentionally to create the appearance of authenticity, but we didn't find any. And this is why professional authentication rarely depends upon a single observation. Instead, investigators assemble dozens of small pieces of evidence until a broader picture begins to emerge. Now, chain of custody may ultimately become the most important issue of all. In criminal investigations, evidence carries a greater weight when investigators can document every person who handled it from the moment it was collected until it appears in court. So historical recordings are no different. Ideally, we would like to know who recorded the broadcast, who preserved the tape, and who first digitized it, who uploaded it online, and whether each generation remained faithful to the original. Unfortunately, the current chain of custody appears incomplete. We have numerous copies, transcripts, and reposts, but very little documentation explaining how the recording traveled from an alleged radio broadcast into thousands of internet uploads. Well, every missing link introduces another opportunity for alteration, accidental editing, or simple misunderstanding. Another avenue worth exploring involves broadcasting engineering records. Again, this is the most detailed report you're ever going to get from the Abe Finkelstein interview, which was absolutely horrific, if true. Radio stations routinely maintain transmission logs, licensing information, engineering notes, and program schedules. I've seen it. It's a pain in the ass doing it, but they have to do it. And even if the audio itself cannot be authenticated directly, supporting documentation may survive elsewhere. A station log confirming that James Wickstrom hosted a particular program on a particular date would strengthen the historical framework here. And we need people that maybe can go out and look for this stuff. I don't know how. I just know how to research on the internet. That's all I'm good at. Likewise, archived newsletters announcing upcoming guests, listener correspondence discussing the interview shortly after it aired, or advertisements promoting the broadcast would all contribute independent evidence. And sometimes historians authenticate an event, but not because the primary artifact survives intact, but because multiple unrelated documents converge upon the same conclusion. Now, perhaps the greatest lesson from examining the recording is that authenticity is rarely established by instinct. Listeners often say they can just tell whether something sounds real or not. Well, experiences teach us otherwise. Some genuine recordings seem unbelievable, while some carefully staged productions sound completely authentic. You can go to the Bigfoot of the Bigfoot video, where they've still today. There's skeptics and there's people who believe it, and I can't remember the name of it. It's a very popular Bigfoot just walking near a creek back in the 50s, 60s, and it's still to this day. They are still examining the recording and trying to find evidence that this is a real being. So the question, human intuition is valuable, folks, okay? And some genuine recordings really seem unbelievable, but some carefully staged productions sound completely authentic. Now, human intuition is valuable, but it cannot replace systematic investigation. The question before us is not whether the interview feels convincing. The question is whether it can withstand careful examination using the same methods historians, archivists, audio engineers, and forensic investigators apply to every other disputed recording. And at this stage, the recording remains our strongest piece of evidence today, and also our greatest unanswered question. And it undoubtedly exists. It contains two voices engaged in an extended conversation. And beyond that, much remains uncertain. So we do not yet possess the original source recording, a documented chain of custody, professional forensic analysis, or independent broadcast records confirming every aspect of its history. So those gaps should not discourage the investigation. They actually define it. And those gaps should not discourage the investigation as well. As we move forward, our attention turns away from the recording itself and toward the world that supposedly produced it. If the broadcast truly aired, then somewhere beyond the audio should exist a station, a network, schedules, advertisements, listeners, and records waiting to be rediscovered, and that is where our search continues. So at this point in our investigation, we've examined the interviewer, questioned the identity of the guest, and considered what the recording itself can and cannot tell us. Now we arrive at what may become the most productive part of the entire investigation. Instead of asking questions about the people on the recording, we begin asking questions about the broadcast itself. Every radio program leaves behind traces. Programs need stations. Stations need schedules. Schedules are printed in newspapers, newsletters, advertisements, and station logs. Listeners talk about broadcasts, callers reference previous episode, and hosts announce upcoming guests. Now, if this interview was genuinely broadcast over a radio network, then somewhere outside the recording itself, there should be evidence that the broadcast actually occurred. And there should also be just a person who heard it one time. And I would love for that person to get a hold of me and say, yes, I heard it on this radio station at this day and hour. That is evidence. And you can email me at me@jamescarner.com. me@jamescarner.com. Me. One of the first names mentioned during the interview is the Turner Radio Network. Now, at first glance, this appears to be the promising lead. If investigators could locate historical schedules, affiliate stations, or archived programming from the network, then they might be able to establish when the interview aired and whether it was promoted in advance. Now, surprisingly, this trail quickly becomes more complicated than expected. Depending on the date assigned to the interview, references to the Turner Radio Network become difficult to reconstruct. Some websites mention it only in passing, while others repeat information that appears to originate from the interview itself rather than from independent records. Now, this does not mean that the network did not exist, but it reminds us that repeating the same information across hundreds of websites does not create new evidence. Independent confirmation must remain essential. So there is also the mysterious figure known as the Pastor Bob. Earlier in the recording, James Wickstrom tells listeners that he is filling in for Pastor Bob while the regular host is away. Now, at first, this sounds like an ordinary introduction, but from an investigative perspective, it may be one of the most valuable clues in the entire recording. If Pastor Bob hosted the regular program, then he may have announced the upcoming guest before the broadcast or referred back to the interview afterward. He may have maintained newsletters, mailing lists, cassette archives, or program schedules. And if he's still living, he could potentially answer questions that no document can. Well, identifying Pastor Bob may ultimately prove more important than identifying Rabbi Abe Finkelstein because it could establish the historical framework surrounding the broadcast itself. I'm going over all of these details because I want you guys to understand that this is what needs to be done in order for us to tell the truth. This is what needs to be done in order for us to be Christians. We have to go through these hard, difficult steps to get to the information and not just assume that we heard it and it's real. Because we'll be deceived, especially in the age of information now. This should be a learning tool for you guys tonight. Now, another question naturally follows. Was the interview promoted before it aired? Radio interviews, particularly those featuring unusual or controversial guests, or often announced days or even weeks in advance. Well, stations advertise upcoming programs because interviews attract listeners. Church bulletins, ministry newsletters, local newspapers, and station calendars, they frequently contain notices about future broadcasts. And also, they get scared sometimes about some guests that they put on because it could frighten their advertisers who are paying them money to put their stuff on, and they don't want to be affiliated anywhere with McDonald's hamburgers made out of human flesh, which supposedly was in this recording. I have no evidence of it. But if such announcements can be located, then that would be strong evidence that the interview was planned rather than assembled after the fact. Even if no recording survives, an advertisement mentioning the guest, the date, and the station would significantly strengthen the historical record. I couldn't find anything. Now, the listeners themselves may also hold valuable evidence. Before podcasts and streaming services, many radio listeners routinely recorded broadcasts onto cassette tapes for later listening. Some archived entire series of programs, others mailed recordings to friends or exchanged tapes through newsletters and conferences. It is entirely possible that multiple copies of this interview exist in private collections, sitting unnoticed in basements, garages, or forgotten storage boxes. Well, those copies could maintain portions of the broadcast that are missing from the versions currently circulating online. They might preserve station identifications, commercial breaks, or introductions that were removed during later editing. And finding even one earlier generation recording could answer questions that have remained unresolved for years. And again, how come nobody has gone through all of this information and tried to find all this down? I couldn't find anything, but there are people out there that probably have this sitting in a box somewhere. If you do, send it to me. As our research continued, another observation became increasingly important. Nearly every modern upload of the interview appears to resemble every other upload. The wording, the edits, the transcript, and even the presentation often look remarkably similar. Now, this raises a natural question: where is the earliest surviving copy? Now, historians frequently went backward through digital history, tracing documents from one website to another until they reached the oldest known source. I couldn't find any. And sometimes this process uncovers surprising discoveries. A recording believed to originate in 2000, the year 2000, may first appear online years later. It's pretty normal, actually. And a transcript may reveal edits introduced during digitization. Now, an old web page, and I didn't find anything in the Wayback Machine, preserved in the Internet Archive may contain details later admitted from other versions. So reconstructing this digital family tree is often just as important as examining the record itself. Now, the internet has changed the way information spreads, but it has also complicated historical research. Once a recording becomes popular, hundreds of websites copy one another's descriptions without independently verifying the information. And over time, repeated statements begin to appear authoritative simply because they have been quoted so many times. Now, researchers call this circular sourcing. One website cites another, which cites another until everyone appears to agree despite tracing back to a single original claim, which is normal. And avoiding circular sourcing requires identifying the earliest available source and determining whether later writers actually added new evidence or merely repeated what others had already written. And there's another avenue of investigation that deserves attention. Government records. Now, radio stations in the United States operate under federal licensing requirements. They maintain ownership information, engineering records, transmission data, and licensing documentation. If you have any, send it my way. While many program schedules have disappeared, stations record sometimes they survive in unexpected places. Newspaper libraries, university archives, local historical societies, and broadcast museums, they all occasionally preserve material that broadcasters themselves discarded decades ago. Investigators have solved historical broadcasting mysteries before by locating forgotten engineering logs or local television guides that nobody thought to examine. But this reminds us that the important evidence is often found outside the places that people normally search. One of the most encouraging aspects of this investigation is that it remains open because there's still information out there that I can't find. And unlike many historical mysteries where all the participants have passed away and all known documents have been exhausted, this case still offers realistic opportunities for discovery. So at this stage, the interview has become more than just a recording. It has become a historical puzzle made of people, places, broadcasts, archives, and missing documents. And rather than becoming discouraged by the gaps, we should basically view these gaps as invitations to keep searching. And somewhere there may be forgotten program schedule, an old cassette tape, or a station log could be brought to our purview, because we know the guy who interviewed the rabbi exists and is real. We can't prove that this was broadcast live. If it was, then it adds to the story and can give some more credibility to, did this guy really say all these things, and did he really believe in what he was saying? Now, one of the easiest mistakes investigators can make is arguing about a document without first reading it carefully. And that may sound obvious, but it happens more often than people realize. Many individuals who defend the Wickstrom interview have only heard short clips shared on social media, and they say, God told me. Likewise, many who dismiss it appear to rely on brief summaries or fact-check articles rather than the complete recording. And before asking whether the interview is authentic, we should first understand exactly what it contains. Only then can we evaluate its individual claims against independent historical evidence. And one characteristic becomes immediately apparent as the conversation unfolds. The interview is not centered on a single topic. Instead, it moves rapidly across a wide range of subjects. And it's brilliant if it's a hoax. The guest discusses banking, the Federal Reserve, world wars, religion, Zionism, the Talmud, politics, immigration, media ownership, communism, the Holocaust, 9/11, Hollywood, feminism, economics, race, and numerous other issues, saying that the Jews are behind it all. No joke. Not the real Jews in Israel, but the Zionist Jews who apparently control Israel. Now, a historian specializing in World War II, well, take a step back. This actually creates a challenge for investigators because each subject belongs to a different field of study entirely. That's a challenge, okay? And a historian specializing in World War II is unlikely to be an expert in monetary policy. So this is why it kind of makes it a little bit more difficult. But again, the way it flows, it's just too natural. And the first category involves historical statements. Throughout the conversation, references are made to events such as the Russian Revolution, the founding of the Federal Reserve, the Balfour Declaration, the World Wars, and the creation of modern Israel. Well, these are all documented historical subjects with extensive scholarly literature, and some descriptions offered during the interview align loosely with widely accepted historical timelines, while others reflect interpretations that remain disputed or are rejected by many historians. Well, that distinction is important. An interview that contains both accurate historical references and unsupported conclusions with the same conversation. Historians therefore avoid accepting or rejecting an entire document simply because portions of it prove correct or incorrect. We just can't. And the second category consists of claims regarding economics and finance. Considerable attention is given to central banking, debt interest, international finance, and political influence. Well, these topics have generated legitimate debate for more than a century, and scholars disagree about the degree of influence exercised by financial institutions. Not all scholars say that banks are the enemy. Not all scholars say that the banks are the problem. They don't. So they disagree about the degree of influence exercised by banks, multinational corporations, lobbying organizations, and central banks over public policy. Well, those debates are real and well documented. However, moving from documented influence to claims of total control, well, that requires additional evidence. It really does. And distinguishing between influence, coordination, ownership, and control, well, that's essential because those terms are often used interchangeably, despite describing very different relationships. So careful definitions matter if we hope to evaluate complex economic claims fairly. And no doubt there's shenanigans going on behind the scenes. They just don't record it and put it out into the public for a reason. But we can't just blindly accept something because, hey, trust me, bro. Now, another major section in the interview concerns religion. References are made to Judaism, Christianity, biblical passages, rabbinic literature, and the Talmud, and also interpretations of religious identity. Now, these are subjects that deserve careful treatment because religious texts are frequently quoted without context. A sentence removed from a larger discussion can appear to mean something entirely different from its original intent. The same challenge exists when interpreting Christian writings, Jewish literature, Islamic texts, or any ancient document. Well, rather than relying upon isolated quotations circulating online, investigators should examine complete passages, consult multiple translations where appropriate, and consider how recognized scholars understand the text. Now, doing so does not require agreement with every scholar's conclusion. Who cares? It simply ensures that criticism begins with accurate representation rather than an incomplete quotation. Same with the information I'm putting out right now. This is more information about the study of this this interview, and how we can come to gather more information than anybody else has put out there so far. Trust me, if you go online and you search it, you're only going to find one sentence about this entire thing. And so I'm going through all of the questions that need to be answered in order for us to accept this thing as real. So, as we continued reviewing the interview, another interesting pattern emerged. Much of the conversation is rhetorical rather than evidentiary. It's just rhetorical. The interviewer frequently makes broad accusations while the guest responds in ways that appear designed to provoke a reaction. Now, whether the exchange represents a genuine interview, a scripted performance, or something in between remains part of our larger investigation, but regardless, the style of the conversation itself should caution listeners against assuming that every statement functions as a documented factual claim. It basically, in a way, and this is where I'm like, I didn't think about that. It's like this one short, quick interview answers all the questions about what they're doing, and that's impossible. Okay, the big game plan, from like Peter Thiel and the technocrats. Their big game plan cannot be summarized in just one interview, okay? It is a book full of information on what they're trying to achieve, and you can't summarize it in 4 or 5 paragraphs. You just can't. And it seemed like the entire Jewish narrative of the Zionist control of the world was all placed into this one interview, and that's impossible. But we don't know. This could be, a divine interview from God who allowed it to happen, put them together, and it's online, and they could be trying so hard to dismiss it as a hoax. It could be, because I've never seen such an interview be disqualified, discredited with little information to discredit it for. So we need to distinguish literal assertions from rhetorical performance here, because another important task when evaluating controversial recordings really is coming up. The observation leads me to a useful investigative method. And rather than asking whether the interview is true, we should ask whether each specific claim can be independently verified. For example, if the interview references a historical law, can we locate the law? If it names an organization, we can actually examine the organization's records. If it describes an economic event, we can compare it with financial history, right? Well, we can do all of that, and that would take forever. My point is, I'm trying to just get to the bottom of where's all the information on this? Why is it hidden, and why is it not? Okay, if this is all a hoax, then there should be enough evidence to say, yeah, this dude made it up. But one of the greatest dangers in researching controversial subjects is allowing agreement with one statement to become agreement with everything else. Can't do that. History rarely works that way. A speaker may accurately describe one event while misunderstanding another. And it seems like this didn't go in that direction. It just flowed. So a document may preserve authentic details alongside exaggerations or opinions, and investigators therefore avoid all or nothing thinking. We can't do that. So instead, every claim receives its own evaluation, and some may eventually move into the category of documented fact, but others, may remain plausible but unconfirmed. And by the end of this review, one conclusion becomes unavoidable. The interview should not be treated as a single piece of evidence. Okay, there has to be something else that's attached to it. Has this dude been interviewed somewhere else? Other questions like that. And the interview, it could be a collection of many different claims spanning history, economics, religion, politics, and culture. But some of those claims can be investigated directly through documents and historical records, which I have not done yet. Others remain difficult or impossible to verify with currently available evidence yet. But also the evidence is upon which those conclusions rest. So far, where we are. And the fact checkers. The first thing that comes apparent is nearly every fact checker follows a remarkably similar pattern. Rather than analyzing the interview from beginning to end, they usually focus on a small number of easily verifiable issues. And the most common example concerns the photograph frequently used to represent Rabbi Abe Finkelstein. Once they see the photograph, boom, fact check, that's not him, bye-bye. Well, this is an important correction because it demonstrates that the commonly used photograph is misidentified. And I would agree. And any responsible investigator should acknowledge that fact immediately. And once that issue is established, however, many articles move directly to the conclusion that the interview itself must therefore be fabricated. Well, I never saw it with that photograph back in 2006. I saw it with no photographs. It was just pastor and rabbi and just text as far as that's it, just text. It was just text and a recording. But the photograph does not establish, right, that it proves it's correct. Now, this illustrates an important distinction between disproving a piece of supporting material and disproving the primary evidence itself. Imagine discovering that a documentary used the wrong photograph while discussing Abraham Lincoln. Well, the mistake image would certainly require correction, but it would not automatically prove that every historical statement made in the documentary was false. And also, perhaps the most interesting aspect of the fact-checking process is not what is included, but what's omitted. Very few articles attempt to authenticate the recording itself. Why? There's little discussion of forensic audio analysis, broadcast engineering, generation loss, chain of custody, or the historical record of the radio network that allegedly carried the interview. Why? Likewise, there is little effort to identify Pastor Bob. Why? Or locate the station schedules, or recover advertisements, or trace the earliest surviving copies of the recording. Why? Instead, many articles appear satisfied once the identity of the alleged rabbi becomes uncertain. Well, from a journalistic perspective, that may be understandable, but from a historical perspective, it leaves many important questions unanswered, meaning it sure makes this story seem more legit. But one thing becomes increasingly clear. The fact checkers have answered some important questions, particularly regarding the misidentified photograph and the difficulty of verifying the guest's identity. But that's it. Many aspects of the interview remain largely unexplored. So, fact checkers, you screwed the pooch on this one. So, why do so many people believe the interview? Well, at this point, we spent a considerable time examining documents, timelines, recordings, fact checks. We've talked all about the processes, and now we arrive at a different kind of question. Why has this interview continued to persuade so many people? Well, part of the answer lies in the historical movement in which many people first encountered it. Okay, this was back right before Obama was in, and the Bush and the Clintons did their thing, and everyone was pissed off. Then and they were thinking that the government was getting ready to take over the United States and declare martial law. This was all the stuff that's happening now started happening then. It's like everything changed after 9/11. And over the last several decades, public trust in institutions, well, it declined, and confidence in governments, media, financial institutions, pharmaceutical companies, intelligence agencies, and even universities have weakened in many countries, especially in America. And this erosion of trust did not happen because of a single event. It developed gradually through wars, financial crisis, government scandals, 9/11, intelligence disclosures, corporate misconduct, and repeated examples of officials making statements that were later corrected or contradicted. Lies, 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 lies. Well, the internet accelerated this process dramatically. Before the digital age, controversial broadcasts often disappeared after they aired. Well, today, a single recording can be copied thousands of times and translated into multiple languages. Reposted also across countless of platforms and introduced to entirely new audiences every few years. Well, as each generation discovers the interview, this one, the cycle begins again. And some listeners accept it immediately, others reject it just as quickly, but very few stop to investigate its origins. And in many ways, the internet has transformed the Rabbi Finkelstein recording from a historical artifact into a reoccurring cultural event continuously rediscovered but rarely examined in depth. And censorship further complicates this picture. It does. Throughout history, governments, corporations, religious institutions, private organizations, they have all suppressed information for various reasons. Okay, it's a matter of national security here, Well, sometimes harmful misinformation has been removed to prevent fraud or violence. Well, at other times, truthful reporting has been censored because it threatened those in positions of power. Both situations have occurred repeatedly throughout history because of that reality. The mere removal of content does not establish whether the content was true or false. Censorship tells us something about the actions of those doing the censoring, but it does not automatically resolve the accuracy of the material itself. Now, that distinction is essential because many supporters of the Wickstrom interview point to its removal from certain platforms as evidence of authenticity, while critics point to the same removals as evidence that platforms were responding to misinformation. But neither conclusion follows automatically from censorship alone. Well, throughout the investigation, we've deliberately resisted the temptation to reach a final verdict too quickly. Instead, we've gathered documents, examined timelines, evaluated claims, and identified unanswered questions. Now it's time to organize everything that we know into what investigators call an evidence board. Detectives, historians, intelligence analysts, and forensic researchers all use similar methods. All right, you get this board, and all evidence point like in a triangle. Rather than allowing facts, opinions, rumors, and assumptions to blend together, they separate information into categories based upon the strength of the supporting evidence. And the very first category that we have is verified facts. Well, these are statements supported by independent evidence from multiple sources. Wickstrom was a real individual. His ministry existed. His radio broadcasts are well documented. His sermons, writings, and public activities have been preserved through newspapers, government records, recordings, and publications. Likewise, the recording itself unquestionably exists, okay? But we don't know if it's really, we just don't have enough information to say, was this broadcast, and who is Abe Finkelstein? They form the foundation upon which every other part of our investigation rests, and establishing what is known with confidence prevents us from wasting time arguing over questions that have already been answered, okay? The second category contains strong evidence, the conclusion supported by substantial evidence, but still leave room for additional confirmation. Well, the photograph calmly presented as Rabbi Finkelstein, well, that is not strong evidence, and multiple independent researchers have demonstrated that the image actually belongs to attorney Kenneth Feinberg rather than the mysterious guest heard in the interview. Now, we don't know if someone put it in there just as a joke to throw people off. We just don't know. But the consistency among surviving versions suggests that they descend from an earlier source, although the original recording itself has not been located. So that's not him. The third category is plausible but unverified. Now, this is where many historical investigations spend most of their time, unfortunately. Could the guest have used an alias? Certainly. History contains numerous examples of anonymous interviews and pseudonyms. It happens. Could the recording have aired on the Turner radio broadcast? Well, as described, possibly. Could Pastor Bob have hosted the regular program before and after Wickstrom? Yeah, possibly. Then comes the contradicted claims, and every investigation eventually encounters information that contradicts and conflicts with the available evidence. Well, we haven't gone through all of the stuff that they were talking about, but it was most likely everything seemed to be a conspiracy theory. We couldn't prove it. But the largest section of our evidence board is basically labeled unknown, okay? Think about that. That's an important clue. The largest section of our evidence board is labeled unknown. So with that evidence board complete, we're finally prepared to ask one last question. If the missing pieces were ever found, an original broadcast tape, station logs, archived newsletters, private cassette recordings, or eyewitness testimony, what would they need to show in order to settle this mystery once and for all? Well, every investigation eventually reaches a point where the available evidence has been exhausted. I don't think we're there yet at all. I think there's still more information out there. It depends on how much time you take, okay? I just took a couple days doing research on this. If someone was really interested in trying to prove that this was real and that guy, what he said was real, then someone needs to spend months going undercover and making discoveries. And they need to go to Pastor Bob. They need to find out if he's real. They need to go to the Turner broadcast, find out if that was real. They need to start their own evidence board and just work with it. But what's interesting is the most important lesson from this entire investigation has little to do with James Wickstrom or even Rabbi Abe Finkelstein, because it concerns the process of seeking truth itself. Guys, we live in an age where information spreads faster than verification. A claim can circle the globe within minutes, while careful investigation may require months or years. Social media rewards certainty. Algorithms reward controversy. Nuance often appears beneath headlines designed to provoke immediate emotional reactions. Yet, truth has never been obligated to move at the speed of public opinion. Truth waits patiently for those willing to gather documents, compare evidence, ask direct questions, difficult questions, and admit when the available information is sufficient. Well, what did we find out from this investigation? Well, the story's not finished. It's far from it. I don't think anybody has been able to, or I don't think anybody has done any more research other than wrong picture, goodbye. And I say, you should never surrender your responsibility to think critically here. Okay? Never surrender that. Ask what evidence supports it. Ask what evidence contradicts it. And most importantly, remain willing to change your mind when new information appears, because that willingness is not a sign of weakness. It's the very foundation of honest investigation. Now, the mystery of Abe Finkelstein may one day be solved, but we didn't solve it today. There's not a lot of information out there, but I showed you how to go out there and find it. I only spent a couple days. If you can spend more, give me the information that you find. Is it real? I'm 50-50 here. 50% fake, hoax, 50% could be real. We don't know. You just don't know. So the mystery, it may be solved one day, and it may ultimately prove to be exactly what some people have claimed, or it may prove to be something entirely different. We don't know yet. But for now, we've reached the edge of the available evidence. I got nothing more. And beyond that edge lies speculation, and speculation is where responsible investigators stop until the facts emerge.
This has been Cause Before Symptom with your host, James Carner. Go to his website, jamescarner.com, and sign up for his newsletter. Also, download his free books, The Breath War, The Ritual Machine, The Crown of Blood, The Stone That Speaks, and The Crown of Cain. Oh, and one more thing. If you could just try and love your neighbor, we believe the world would be a better place. See you tomorrow.